In the previous episode, Lin encountered a succubus. Though he managed to kill the monsters under her control, she still managed to slip away. As he continued his quest to find the Divine Selection's secret realm and gain a trace of divinity, he faced many enemies in the following days. Not only did these encounters serve as free experience points, but they also allowed Lin to quickly rise to the rank of colonel. However, not long after, a colossal monster appeared before him. As we continue the story, the monster stood hundreds of meters tall, with countless limbs and sharp claws, resembling a gigantic centipede. The squad trailing behind Lin instantly recognized it. A single low roar from the monster was enough to cause landslides, sending massive rocks flying toward them. The knight quickly activated group protection, deflecting the rocks and keeping everyone safe. It was then that everyone saw the monster's true form. Lin was a bit surprised, but remained rather calm on the outside. However, the captain did not share his composure. His eyes were filled with despair. "It's really the Earth Dragon God," he muttered, trembling all over, barely able to hold his weapon. "We're doomed!" The monster seemed to have just awakened and was still roaring. The force of its roar was so powerful that it sliced the nearby monsters in half. Poor little dinosaurs, just minding their own business, were caught in the chaos. The shockwave from the roar spread out like a mushroom cloud from a nuclear explosion. Even Lin was a bit taken aback, thinking this might be the biggest boss in terms of size he'd ever seen. But how powerful is it really? The wind howled, making it difficult to breathe. The squad seemed resigned to dying at the hands of this powerful creature. But they still had one question on their mind. How had they ended up in its territory? The captain quickly sensed something was amiss. Someone must have deliberately led them here, perhaps specifically targeting Lin. Lin realized this too. Over the past few days, the demons had subtly altered his path. Each encounter with an abyssal demon had caused him to veer slightly, leading him right to this place. Someone had clearly been guiding him here without his noticing. Not far away in the sky, the succubus who previously got away clutched a black gemstone, which projected the image of the succubus queen. "Have you succeeded?" asked the succubus queen. "We learn that the succubus's name is Alice." Alice nodded vigorously. "Yes, my great queen. It's done." She told her that Lin had entered the Earth Dragon God's territory, and the creature had fully awakened, assuming Lin was as good as dead. Hearing this, the succubus queen nodded in satisfaction. She had seen Lin before, and knew he was the greatest prodigy of this new generation of human professionals. If somehow he died in the eternal trial grounds, even if he could be resurrected, he would never regain his full potential. This thought brightened her mood considerably. She then instructed Alice that once Lin was dead and the Earth Dragon God moved to a new location, she must retrieve the primordial rune, but warned her not to touch it since it would activate right away. Alice bowed her head respectfully. "As you command, my great queen." Alice put away the black gemstone, her eyes gleaming with sinister delight as she looked down. This was all her doing. She had successfully trapped Lin in this inescapable territory. Meanwhile, the captain shouted to Lin, explaining that the Earth Dragon God was one of the most terrifying world bosses in the upper layer of the eternal trial ground. Usually, it remained dormant, awakening only to feed or when someone approached. Now, the area was completely sealed off by it. Lin used his detection spell and discovered that this was a level 55 world boss. Its strength, agility, and vitality each reached a staggering 100,000, while its spirit was 60,000. It possessed 3 powerful skills and 3 special traits, all focused on reducing incoming damage. Despite its terrifying attributes, Lin was actually thinking about whether he could absorb its soul into his scythe and summon it in the future. The captain looked at Lin in astonishment. When he saw Lin draw his scythe, he could hardly believe it. He didn't see the slightest trace of panic or fear in Lin's eyes, only excitement. Had he gone mad? Seeing Lin's courage, the captain and his teammates exchanged glances and nodded resolutely. They all gritted their teeth and drew their weapons. If he was going to be crazy, they would be crazy together. The captain, not ready to accept his fate without a fight, told Lin they would fight alongside him. But Lin's response left them stunned. It turned out Lin had told them to retreat as far as possible. Before they could react, a piercing screech rang out. The Earth Dragon God suddenly burst from the ground, its massive limbs striking at Lin. Although Lin had cast a layer of skeletal armor on himself, It was shattered almost instantly. The squad members were blown back by the impact, landing in a heap. As they struggled to get up, Lin's voice reached them, telling them to stay back to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. Lin then raised one hand, and the captain, watching intently as he turned to run, often turning his head while running, saw countless armored skeletons rising from the ground like an entire army. Although they knew Lin could summon skeletons, they had no idea he could summon so many. Wasting no time, Lin cast a slowing curse. The captain realized why Lin had told them to stay back. They weren't in a party, so this skill could affect them too. Seeing the red shackles spread out in all directions, the squad members quickened their steps and ran as fast as they could. The curse slowed the monster's movements, and the skeletal warriors charged at it. However, due to its traits and thick, durable scales, the skeletons dealt minimal damage, which only enraged the monster further. It roared again, its hundreds of massive limbs slashing like blades, sending the nearby skeletons flying. The undead general then cast his Legion healing spell, mending the skeletons bit by bit. Lin didn't just stand there and watch. Seizing the moment, he unleashed Soul Flame onto the monster. The Soul Flame caused the monster unprecedented pain, but it also made it angrier. As a result, 3 skeletal warriors and 2 skeletal mages were killed instantly. Despite the Legion's enhancements, the skeletons simply didn't have enough damage to penetrate its scales. Clearly, the root of the problem was Lin's level, which was too low in comparison to effectively harm the monster anytime soon. It would likely take him a while to wear down the monster. However, Lin's nearly inexhaustible spirit attribute gave him a massive advantage. He decided to see who could last the longest. After all, when you're facing a guy with basically no skill cooldown, infinite mana, and insanely high damage, what can you do? Anyway, the monster, bearing the pain, launched another attack on Lin, charging at him once again. Each time Lin's skeletal armor showed any cracks, he would refresh it with a new set before it completely shattered. The squad watched in amazement from a distance. They all expected Lin to be some sort of mage, but he seemed tougher than a knight, tanking the creature's attacks like they were nothing. The knight gulped, thinking that if he were in Lin's shoes, he wouldn't survive even if he used all his skills at once. Seeing its attacks were ineffective, the monster stood up and used its skill, Slice. Its limbs turned into razor-sharp blades, slashing at Lin relentlessly. Lin blocked each strike and then commanded his skeletons to launch a second wave of attacks. The skeletons leaped onto the monster, climbing its body, while Lin continued to fend off its strikes. The undead general cast another Legion buff, and each skeleton executed a rampage strike. This time, the monster's scales cracked, bit by bit, until finally revealing massive wounds. Seizing the opportunity, Lin unleashed bone spikes, targeting the exposed wounds and piercing the monster's body. It screamed in agony, thrashing wildly on the ground. But it wasn't enough to take it down. The monster quickly recovered and flung away the nearby skeletal warriors, then used its sweeping skill, rapidly spinning. The powerful impact instantly killed over 20 skeletons and injured many more. Next, the monster spewed a large amount of green toxic mist from its mouth and body. This was its other skill, Deadly Miasma, which covered a vast area. Lin stood within the poisonous mist, his skeletal armor glowing. Although he didn't take any damage, the skill's continuous damage and corrosive effect on everything around worried him. Just like that, his skeletal warriors began to melt. However, Lin remained unconcerned. With the undead general present, such damage over time skills were the least of his worries, as long as the skeletons running for their lives until the mist finally stopped spreading. Gasping for breath, they took a moment to rest. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Actually survive this? Right now, their only hope was that he could. If he failed, they were all dead. One young team member, looking seriously worried, asked the captain if he ever regretted it. After all, if they hadn't followed Lin, they wouldn't be in this mess. The captain's answer came instantly. He smiled and shook, he said. The others looked at him in surprise as he continued. Even if I had doubts at first, I realized we're all human and should support each other. He raised his staff and took a few steps forward. Besides, Lin's our junior. If anyone should lead the charge and risk their life, it's me, his senior. Back in the thick of battle, Lin was still holding his own. The monster's sharp limbs kept cutting down his skeletal warriors, and the dense toxic mist was making it hard for Lin to see. But then he had a realization. The mist also meant no one else could see what was happening. If that's the case, then he didn't need to hold back anymore. Lin then raised his scythe and called out, "Come forth, Soul Devourer Insect King." Within seconds, the king emerged. Despite having relatively weaker stats, its special trait, which ignored defenses and any physical immunity, would soon come in handy. Lin smirked at the monster, saying, "I've heard your scales were tough?" In the blink of an eye, the two world bosses clashed. The Insect King bit into the monster, tearing off chunks of its scales along with its flesh. The monster fought back, using its sweeping skill to fling the Insect King away. But the Insect King landed safely, opened its mouth, and unleashed a sonic attack, a crowd control skill which froze the monster in place like it was nailed to the ground. Charging up, the Insect King used its soul-devouring skill. In mere seconds, the monster's soul was pulled out, floating helplessly in the air. Lin knew that because of their level difference, defeating the monster through normal means would take forever, if it was even possible. But soul attacks? Those were a different story. Without its body to protect it, the monster's soul was exposed and vulnerable to Lin's soul flames, which did massive damage. The monster's soul quickly started to dissipate, growing weaker by the second.